Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with a Victober video. It feels great to say that. This is my first Victober video that I am filming this year. I don't know when you're seeing it, so maybe I'm saying this on the 15th of October and you're thinking, Jenny, you're way late to this. But I don't know when this is going up. But I have recently been asking on my YouTube community tab and also over on Instagram, a couple of questions of y'all about your worst Victorian novels and also your best. I saw people doing this with different genres last year, kind of reacting to their audience's favorite books and also to their least favorite books. And I thought it would just be really fun to do that themed around Victober this year. And so we're kicking this off with me reacting to y'all's worst Victorian classics. And I knew you would deliver. I thought this would be the more fun one, honestly, because I think there is always an attitude in the classics community that some things are above reproach, that really some things shouldn't be critiqued. Those of us who've read a lot of classics know there are a lot of absolutely terrible books out there. Just because they stood the test of time doesn't make them some literary masterpiece. And so I always enjoy critiquing a classic, and I love when others do, because sometimes it feels like you can be shamed for having an opinion on a classic that is negative. So I was really excited and really refreshed to see that a lot of y'all had very controversial opinions about really, really popular Victorian novels. And so some of these I absolutely agree with, and some of them I haven't read, so I'm kind of excited to see where I fall on them. But some of them I disagree with, so this was just really, really fun. I expected to see some titles among the worst and the best. And the worst really delivered for me. And here with the worst Victorian novels, two titles really rose above the rest. Two titles were mentioned more than any other books. And I thought this was really interesting. One of these I definitely expected to see, just knowing the content of the book. But the other I was a little bit shocked by, honestly. So the number one book, the book I would say is the worst, among my audience at least, is Jude the Obscure. This was mentioned over 10 times on both YouTube and Instagram. When I added it together, it was like 15 times this book was mentioned. And this is definitely the one that I expected to see, because this is Thomas Hardy's last novel, I believe, though he lived for 20, 30 years after that, and he just continued writing poetry. The reception to this book at the time was so visceral that he stopped writing novels, apparently. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know if that's an urban legend about him, but it makes sense because nearly everyone I have heard talk about Jude the Obscure in the modern day has hated it. I knew if Kate Howe responded to this that she would say Jude the Obscure, and her comment just really made me laugh. But on YouTube, you have more character space to kind of explain why you didn't like a book, so I thought I would read a couple of these comments. Kate, of course, said, "Mine will come as no surprise, Jude the friggin' Obscure." Faith of Faith in Books also said, "Jude the Obscure, it made me so angry. I threw it across the room and didn't read Hardy again for years. I still don't like him anymore." And both of these comments got a lot of likes, so I think it's interesting. Clearly, a lot of people really agree with this. This is one that people always talk about as just being very heavy, really, really sad to the point of just genuine depression. And I have never read it, even though I own a copy. I think I picked up a copy at a library book sale years ago just because it was Hardy. And then I learned what the book was about, and I said, it's gonna be a no from me. I still have it on my shelves just in case one day, but the older I have gotten, and really post-pandemic, stuff that's very heavy like that is really, really hard for me to read. And I sometimes think Hardy does that anyway. He'll just make people suffer for no apparent reason. And that's apparently Jude the Obscure from beginning to end. So I wasn't shocked to see this one mentioned the most. But the second most mentioned book is one that was a shock to me, and that is Villette by Charlotte Bronte. Now, I have also DNF'd Villette. So I'm going to say that I feel like I have to agree with this because I was bored to tears. And that was generally the comment that people made. This one just really, really bored them. A lot of people just said, Villette's so boring. Villette was a massive disappointment to me. And it's been so long since I attempted Villette that I honestly don't recall what it was about, but I do recall just being genuinely bored to tears. And I have to say, sadly enough, that has been my experience with every Charlotte Bronte novel that wasn't Jane Eyre. I have been genuinely bored by her, and I don't know if her writing is for me. In the end, sometimes I wonder if Jane Eyre is for me, because that was a book I hated the first time I read it. And Jane Eyre was also mentioned quite a bit here. And I think Jane Eyre is a really interesting one to say was disappointing, because most people who had a complaint about Jane Eyre in the comments mentioned the last half, and I won't post their comments here because maybe it goes into spoiler territory if you haven't read it. But Jane Eyre does have a pretty big about face in that last third, and it is genuinely shocking just how different tonally it is from the rest of the book. There is a particular character that I think most people associate the worst parts of Jane Eyre with, and he comes up in this last third. And really, it's true, because I remember the first time I read Jane Eyre, that was the part that made me think, this is absolutely awful. This is just terrible. And I really could not believe people talked it up at that point. But there was something about it the second time around that didn't bother me and even made sense to me. Jane Eyre is one of the best Victorian novels to me. And I think sometimes that can be argued with, because I think on an objective level, Jane Eyre has a lot of oddities in the writing. There's a lot about it that doesn't make sense and that doesn't add up sometimes. And so maybe objectively, it's not the best written book out there, but there's something about the characters that clearly speaks to people. But I think even people who are fans of the book will tell you that last third is just weird. And I got one comment on YouTube, and I thought this was so funny, that someone said if you were having a hard time around that point, they would tell you just to put the book down because it's not going to get better. I just thought that was really funny. Jane Eyre is one that I actually really didn't expect to see here as often as I did. I saw it around 7 times. But there is another Bronte sister that I think, of course, we have to talk about. Easily, I think one of the most controversial Victorian novels out there is Wuthering Heights. And this is one I wasn't shocked to see. Wuthering Heights is one of my favorite Victorian novels, possibly my favorite. I just love Wuthering Heights. It is so weird. And it's interesting to talk about with Jane Eyre because Charlotte and Emily were sisters, and they were writing these books kind of around the same time. So it's interesting to think about how the themes interact with one another. But Jane Eyre has just always seemed more universally beloved than Wuthering Heights. Tony had the best comment on this for me because he said, Wuthering Heights, 2 unlikable people and responsible for people thinking that being a git is an attractive quality in a man. To be fair, I should probably reread it. And I think that's interesting. I think Wuthering Heights is one that I want to defend just because I read it when I was an angsty teenager, and there is something about Wuthering Heights that's just like puberty brain. It's just something that's going on when your hormones are high. I feel like you understand the characters far more than you do as an adult who's more rational. And I think Tony's point here is interesting, and I think a lot of the people who hate Wuthering Heights hate it because of somebody like Heathcliff. And what's interesting is that as a teen, I think Heathcliff has a level of appeal. He's sexy in an interesting way. And as an adult, you read Wuthering Heights and you are genuinely horrified by the things that are going on and the stuff that people are willing to put up with for him. I like Heathcliff because I think he's interesting, but there is a scene with a dog in that book that haunts me at night. It was literally one of the greatest scenes of horror that I have ever read. It was genuinely dread-inducing that had to do with Heathcliff and a dog. And from that alone, I think Wuthering Heights should never be described as a romance. I know some people still do, but I think it's more common knowledge now that Wuthering Heights is about toxic relationships, and it's not necessarily a romance you should be rooting for. But there's so much about it in pop culture that portrays it as a genuinely good thing, as a romance that you should be rooting for. And I think a lot of hate for Wuthering Heights comes from that too, that the perceptions of it are very, very off. But I love Wuthering Heights. I, again, wasn't really shocked to see that this one made the worst for a lot of people. This one to me is really interesting for a wide variety of reasons. I think it just has a lot going on. I think the writing is beautiful. I love how hateable the characters are. And I just in general think it's a privilege to read. Like, I wish she was the one we had 4 or 5 books from. Wuthering Heights is very Marmite, and I think you either love it or hate it. So this one was not a shock to me. To see this up here, I knew I was gonna have to defend it, but I think there are plenty of valid reasons to really hate Wuthering Heights. And I think it's interesting to talk about with Jane Eyre because I think there are valid reasons to hate Jane Eyre too. But I think these are the top 4. These are the 4 that I saw mentioned the most often. And so Charlotte Bronte was mentioned twice, but the author that I saw the most of was actually Thomas Hardy. And I'm gonna say, from my perspective, I understand that because I have both loved and hated him. So I had various people saying Far From the Madding Crowd, which is actually one of my favorites of his, Allowed a Sin, and then the one that was mentioned the most other than Jude the Obscure was The Well Beloved. And this is one of his that I have DNF'd. I have a love and hate relationship with Thomas Hardy. Some of his books to me, absolutely incredible. Some of his books to me are really, really terrible. And I can never tell right when I get into a book of his how I'm gonna feel about it. And I feel like nothing is a guarantee with him anymore, honestly. So for me, just because I feel so contentiously about him all the time, I'll never be able to consider him a favorite Victorian author because I've gone back and forth so many times. But The Well Beloved is a really, really weird Thomas Hardy book. And I am not shocked that people who love Hardy hate this one. And I'm also just not shocked that in general, this one has a very low average rating on Goodreads. I looked this up after everyone mentioned it because I was trying to remember what it was about. As with most Hardys, this had a really lush and wonderful setting that was very well described. I think this was set on an island, if I'm remembering right. But the main character was really, really creepy to me. And that's one thing I normally don't say about Thomas Hardy. I feel like he normally writes really well done male characters. 9 times out of 10, they don't come across as creepy or misogynistic to me, but in this case, this really bothered me. So I can see why this one was up there. If you've read this, talk to me about it down in the comments below, because most people just mentioned this title and didn't say what it was they hated about it. Let's talk about a book that I completely agree with. This is my worst Victorian novel. If you were to ask me one that I hate truly, I would tell you this, and that is Dracula. Dracula is one of the biggest disappointments for me of all time. I have tried this book, I think 3 times, finally finished it the 3rd time. I don't know why, when I knew I didn't like it, why I forced myself to finish this one. I hate the book Dracula. And it's so funny because most adaptations of Dracula are incredible. They're just absolutely amazing. And I just think there's something about the story that must not fit very well to the novel, because most people who said Dracula said the same thing. They really enjoy adaptations of this. They really enjoy seeing it on screen, specifically with the 1992 Winona Ryder one. And I think we all really, really like these adaptations because we were probably exposed to them before reading the book. And I've said this before with Dracula in defense of it, even though I don't like it, I don't think I would have liked it anyway. Even though I don't like it, I recognize that Dracula is a book that works better if you are not factoring in all of the pop culture references that we have for him as a character, because there are a lot of instances in Dracula that are actually really scary and really horrifying. The first 100 pages are really, really terrifying to me. And if you put yourself into the mindset of the Victorian reader, someone reading this for the first time who maybe doesn't know what's coming, they don't have the name recognition of Dracula, there's a lot about the book that I think would work better if you went into it blind like that. But for me, this was also poorly written and poorly paced. And a lot of people mention that too. The pacing is weird. This is multiple perspectives. It's epistolary, and so we're reading in journals. Everything about this book should have worked for me because I love epistolary. I love vampires. And the fact that it didn't, I think, is why I have tried it so many times over the years. I really just want to convince myself that I actually do like Dracula, but I don't, and that's okay. Sarah said, Dracula wasn't my favorite. The start is atmospheric. And the part on the ship to England and the bit with the vampire lady luring the children was peak. All of this happens in the first 100 pages, maybe even in the first 50 pages. But the last third of the book is repetitive and dull. The novel wasn't paced the best way. Pacing was the critique that I most often saw with Dracula, and I completely agree. I do think that's its fatal flaw. It's a shame. I really wish that I liked it, but this is one I completely agree with, and if you were to ask me, I think I would say Dracula. I saw the picture of Dorian Gray quite a few times as well. And I have to say, even though I really enjoy the picture of Dorian Gray, it's a weird book, and I just don't think it's for everybody. For me, Dorian Gray is a book we would describe in the modern day as all vibes, no plot. And for me, those books generally tend to work very well. But again, talking about Dorian Gray in contrast to something like Dracula, everybody knows who Dorian Gray is. You know the twist, you know what's coming. And so that is kind of robbed from you in terms of enjoyment when you are reading the book. But for me, the enjoyment of Dorian Gray is all in the writing. I think the writing is absolutely beautiful. To me, that's why I'm reading the book. I just think it's lush and it's wonderful. And I love books that discuss art. And so I think that's also why Dorian Gray works really well for me. But it's something that's very cerebral and it's very philosophical in places. And that was the comment that I saw a lot about Dorian Gray, is that the concepts are interesting, the discussions are interesting, but they're not done very well. And I think I would have to agree with that. I have reread Dorian Gray recently in the past couple of years, and it fell just a little bit for me because I did feel like there were elements that really were not expanded on in the best way. So this is one I completely understand. I can see why people don't like this. I have always recommended Dorian Gray as a great place to start with classics because I think it's where I started. I think I was maybe 12 or 13 reading it. And I'm sure then I was just, once again, all about the vibes and the bigger discussions were going over my head. Rereading it as an adult, I can really see that there were some flaws there. Little Women was also mentioned quite a bit. And I guess technically we might say Little Women doesn't count because I guess it's an American novel. I never knew this. I've said this before. I never knew before the event Victober. I never knew that Victorian literature was only confined to the UK and Ireland, because we have Victorian classes here in the States and we're reading both stuff from the UK, but also stuff that was published here like Mark Twain and stuff like that, Nathaniel Hawthorne. Those are all talked about as Victorian authors. At least they were here where I live. And so it was hard for me to break from that mindset. So I'm gonna say I consider Little Women Victorian, and I also didn't like this. I DNF'd this. A lot of y'all picked books that I DNF'd because I said life's too short for me to put up with this. Little Women actively inspired negative feelings in me. And a lot of people said this was just syrupy sweet. Lou had a comment that really summed it up. She said, for me, it's Little Women. I will probably reread it at some point because I'm probably way off base, but I just found it too syrupy sweet. I know times were tough and tragedies happened, but I just could not relate to the family dynamic. And hers was the most upvoted comment for a long time. So a lot of people feel this way about Little Women. And I tried to read it before that movie came out with Saoirse Ronan a couple of years ago and Timothée Chalamet. I still watch the movie because I love Timothée Chalamet, but it was not great. I didn't like Little Women, and I think a lot of it is that I missed the boat on it. And I think a lot of people who say that they love Little Women, for them, Little Women is one of their favorite books ever. If you say that, I think it tends to be the case that Little Women was something you read a lot as a child. And so you instantly had a bond with the characters and you were reading it, I think, at the target age for the book. Trying to read it in adulthood, I think a lot of things are just too in your face, too blunt in terms of messaging. And that's why I think it's too saccharine. I really did not like Little Women. So I feel kind of vindicated that this is one that other people really didn't like either. So that is another one that I saw, I think, 3 or 4 times. Let's get into Dickens. The amount of times that I saw Bleak House is so unfortunate to me. I saw Bleak House a couple of times, and most of the time when people explained their thoughts on this, it always came down to the fact that Bleak House is told in alternating third-person and first-person perspectives. And I think that makes a lot of sense because to me, I could see how that would drag you out of the story, how that would pull you out of the world for a little bit. Another common complaint with this one is just that it's too long. But I think it's interesting to have seen Bleak House so many times above other books of Charles Dickens's that I think really do have a lot of flaws. I thought Bleak House was kind of above reproach. It seems like it's one that a lot of people really love. So I was interested to see that people had said this. And I have also DNF'd Bleak House before, and it wasn't really to me that the book wasn't good, but I was also beginning to feel its length. It's one I need to come back back to, so I'll be interested to see how I feel about this one when I finally get around to it. But people also mentioned A Tale of Two Cities. And again, even though I love this book, this is the one I understand. This book has a lot going for it, but it also has a lot of detractors. I think you love A Tale of Two Cities because you love what it could be doing. It's just not doing enough. It's not got enough detail in it, but what it could be doing is so interesting. And the ending of this book, I say this all the time, the ending of this book is the best ending that has ever happened in literature. I have never felt like this before, like been in physical pain, except in a couple of other cases. But if you really think about it, the ending is not deserved because a lot of great character work and a lot of great dynamics earlier in the book have been sacrificed to make the book shorter, in my opinion. And so to me, you kind of get to this really wonderful, fabulous ending and you think, this is great, but it could be even better if we had gotten more earlier on. Some people did say, though, that they felt like A Tale of Two Cities emotionally manipulated them. And I think that's interesting because I have felt emotionally manipulated by Charles Dickens before, but it wasn't here. So I do think that is a critique that's often leveled against him, and also that things are a bit too saccharine. To me, the fatal flaw of A Tale of Two Cities is that it's too short. It is not often that I say that when a book is over 300 pages. To me, this one needed another 100, 150 pages just to make us really love the characters and to make us really invested in what was going on. But it's still one of my absolute favorites. I don't want to call out Kelly from books I'm not reading here, but I'm going to because she mentioned two here that no one else mentioned. And I'm actually shocked because one of these books I fully expected to see, and that is Middlemarch. I was shocked that I was not given more George Eliot. I got 3 comments on George Eliot, one from Kelly that said Middlemarch, one from Christy Lewis that said Romola, and then someone else mentioned Silas Marner. And that was all I got. And for me, I think I would say George Eliot is a fairly disappointing author for me. I really did think that Middlemarch would show up here just because this is a very, very long book and it's very quiet. And I really liked Middlemarch at the time of reading it, but this has always been one that I thought was probably not for me. It's just a little bit too quiet. And to me now, whenever anyone describes a book as quiet or simple, I think it's not gonna be for me. I really need you to entertain me. It's sad, it's bread and circuses now for me. And so I feel like on reread, Middlemarch would not work that well for me at all. And so I was interested to see Kelly mention this, but I really thought that I would see more. Kelly also mentioned Wives and Daughters, which was the only Elizabeth Gaskell that I got. And I have never read Wives and Daughters. Wives and Daughters is one of those books that used to haunt me for years and years because I had put it on so many TBRs but never gotten around to it. I looked this up on Goodreads just to see the negative reviews, to see what people were saying about Wives and Daughters. Most commonly, people said this was also saccharine, but also that this is just really too long. And I think 9 times out of 10, most of the books that have been mentioned here are books that people think could have had 100 pages or so shaved off. I'm not sure if Middlemarch and Wives and Daughters were serialized. I'm guessing they were, given their length. But I think serialization is something that really just doesn't work in the modern day. I think we can feel when a book has been serialized and when you spent a little bit too much time on things. And that's why a lot of these books, in my opinion, feel like they need to be shortened down. So those were the worst Victorian novels that y'all have ever read. These books were mentioned the most as some of the worst or most hated Victorian novels that y'all have read. And I thought this was really, really interesting. I would love to know down below your worst Victorian novel. Do you agree with these? But that is going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Happy Victober. Goodbye.